The record of my testimony before the outpost velthari tribunal of inquiry is dated the 14th cycle of the Second Reckoning, in the year of our fleet's 400th expansion. I give it without amendment, without redaction, and without the softening of language that my advocate has recommended. I am Sarath Khan, formerly Vice Commander of the Velthari 7th Lancer Flotilla, now holding no rank, commanding no vessel, speaking to no one in any official capacity. I say formerly. I mean permanently. The tribunal has asked me to begin with the order itself. I will begin there because everything that followed was a consequence of that order, and I would not have the record suggest that what happened at the human dwelling was in any way spontaneous or unplanned, or the result of bad individual judgment in the moment. It was planned. It was deliberate. It was reviewed at 3 levels of command above my own. I approved it. I signed the operational directive with my own mark, pressed my own thumb seal into the authentication block, and transmitted the confirmation to Fleet Command at Tethai Station. I want that understood. Whatever I say after this, whatever the tribunal concludes, that much is not in dispute. The order came down in the 42nd period of that cycle, which by human reckoning corresponds to what they call a deep winter. Their colony on the border world we designated Frontier Marker 11, they had their own name for it, which I will give in time, was not large. 43 registered inhabitants, according to the survey intelligence we had purchased from a Ruathi cartographer who had passed through the system 3 years prior. 43. The settlement was built into the side of a low ridge, mostly underground, as humans prefer when they are not building upward. It had 2 visible structures above the surface, a communications relay tower and what the Ruathi survey described as a common hall. The rest was dug in, insulated, quiet. Command's reasoning was this. The border had been contested for 11 years. Human expansion into the Velthari's reach was steady, inexorable, and to that point had been met with diplomatic protest and the occasional blockade, nothing that had slowed them measurably. The War Council had decided that a message was needed, not a fleet action, not a campaign, a message, something surgical and unmistakable, one settlement, one night, total silence afterward. The humans would understand. They would draw back their frontier. The reach would remain ours. The settlement at Marker 11 was chosen because it was isolated, because it was small, because by the survey intelligence it had no garrison, no dedicated military installation, no ground-based weapons array of any significance, because it was, in the words of Fleet Admiral Tave Soar's operational brief, a soft target. He used that phrase, soft target. I remember reading it and feeling nothing in particular. I had run dozens of border actions. I understood the language. I signed the directive. I tell you all of this so that you understand the confidence we carried into that system. Because what I am about to describe can only be understood correctly if you first understand how thoroughly reasonable every assumption we made appeared to be, and how completely each of those assumptions held up against every piece of intelligence we possessed, and how little that mattered. We had 6 ships. The Velthari 7th Lancer Flotilla was not a line-of-battle force. We were fast, precise, interdiction specialized. Our ships were designed for rapid insertion, targeted action, and clean withdrawal. We had done this kind of work before against Ruathi outposts, against Drevian supply depots, against 2 small colonies belonging to species I will not name here because their cases are sealed in other proceedings. We were good at it. We were very good at it. I bring this up not to boast. I bring it up because I want the tribunal to understand that when I say we were not careless, I mean it precisely. We planned for contingencies. We ran the engagement model 17 times. We had fallback coordinates plotted. We had extraction windows timed to the local orbital mechanics. Vice Commander Hale Teth, my second, had personally reviewed the Ruathi survey data 3 times and found no anomalies. There was nothing in that data, nothing, that should have given us pause. I have since wondered about the Ruathi cartographer. His name was Vetharun Salisk, and his survey file was 12 years old when we purchased it, updated with a single addendum 3 years before our operation. The addendum noted that the human settlement at what was then designated Marker 11 had grown by approximately 9 inhabitants since the original survey and had expanded its underground network by 2 subsections. The addendum did not describe what those subsections contained. I asked later in the context of the preliminary inquiry whether the addendum's silence on the content of those subsections was unusual. I was told it was not. Ruathi cartographers are not military surveyors, and their records are commercial instruments. They note what they can see. They do not speculate about what they cannot see. I accepted this at the time. What I did not accept and did not set aside was a margin note. Vetharun Salisk had added a margin note to the original survey entry for Marker 11. The note was in Ruathi shorthand, which requires a translation layer our staff did not apply until after the events, because margin notes in purchase survey data are not part of our standard pre-operation intelligence review. The note said, roughly translated, "This entry is accurate as of the survey date. I recommend the purchaser conduct their own ground-level verification before any operational application. The settlement is not as it appears from above. The settlement is not as it appears from above." I learned about that margin note 6 days after our return from Marker 11, when the preliminary inquiry team was auditing the intelligence file. 6 days. I have thought about that sequence more than I am able to express usefully to the tribunal. The margin note was in the file. No one read it. We ran our engagement model 17 times against data that came with a note from the person who gathered it saying, "Verify this yourself." And we did not verify it ourselves. And then we went. I want that in the record, not because it changes the legal question of whether the operation was properly authorized. It was, but because if there is any lesson that the fleet can carry away from what I am about to describe, it begins with that margin note. The Ruathi cartographer flew over Marker 11 and looked down and made his measurements and wrote down what the instruments showed him. And then he wrote 5 words by hand at the edge of the page. And somewhere in him, he knew that the 5 words were more important than everything else on the page, and he wrote them anyway, and we did not read them. We made transit on the 44th period, approximately 32 hours after I transmitted the confirmation. The transit itself was unremarkable. We came out of fold space at the system's outer rim, as planned, well beyond the range of any sensor array the settlement could plausibly maintain. We ran silent. We coasted in on minimal drive signature for 11 hours, which is long and uncomfortable but standard for this kind of approach. I spent most of those 11 hours in the command center reviewing the settlement's thermal profile, which our long-range sensors had been building since we cleared the rim. The thermal profile was warm. That is what I remember most about those 11 hours. The settlement was warm. Not warm the way a cold climate outpost is warm, the residual heat of life support, the flat glow of machinery doing its work. This was different. This was the warmth of occupied rooms, of hearth fire equivalents running in every section, of a structure that was lit and alive and busy in a way that had nothing to do with utility and everything to do with choice. Someone had decided the settlement would be warm tonight. Someone had put that warmth into every room and every corridor, and people were moving through that warmth the way people move through a place they have decided is theirs. I watched that profile for 11 hours, and it did not dim or shift or settle into the quieter pattern of a settlement going to sleep. It was the 42nd period, their deep winter, their sacred rest cycle, the one their intelligence files identify as the longest and most observed holiday in their culture, the one they call by a name that translates loosely as the long returning light. Command had chosen this window deliberately. The assumption was that the humans would be distracted, that they would be gathered inside, occupied with their celebration, their attention elsewhere. I watched the thermal profile for 11 hours and I thought, they are celebrating, they are gathered, they are warm and occupied and they do not know we are coming. I thought that was an advantage. I want to pause here and note something for the tribunal that I did not note in my original after-action summary, because at the time I did not think it was relevant. During those 11 hours on approach, I attempted 3 times to reach the settlement on the frequencies we had been given for emergency hailing. I did this not because I planned to warn them, that was not the mission, but as part of our standard electronic intelligence sweep, to confirm the settlement's communications posture, and to verify that no signal traffic was leaving the system in a direction that might indicate they had detected us. The hails went unanswered. The communications relay tower was active. We could see it cycling, but no one responded to our silent probes. I logged this as normal, an unmonitored relay on a holiday night. Of course, no one was watching the long-range receiver. They were inside, celebrating. I log it now for a different reason. I log it because I have thought, subsequently, about what an unmonitored receiver might mean in context, and whether the word unmonitored is the correct word for a relay that is active and cycling, but that generates no response when hailed. I have thought about the difference between no one is watching and someone is watching and choosing not to answer. I did not think about that difference during those 11 hours. I think about it now. The 3 hailing probes went unanswered. The relay cycled. We continued our approach. We made our final approach at the 43rd period local night, which gave us maximum visual cover and thermal contrast for our targeting systems. The temperature on the surface was well below the point at which humans operate comfortably outdoors, which we considered an additional advantage. They would all be inside. The 6 ships of the 7th Lancer came in low over the ridge, using the terrain for radar masking as planned, and took up our designated positions in a loose hemisphere around the settlement's visible structures. The first thing I noticed was the light. The settlement was lit up in a manner that I had not anticipated from the thermal profile alone, not the cold white light of operational infrastructure. The lights were warm and multicolored, strung along the surface structures and the visible portions of the underground access points in patterns that had no tactical function I could identify. Decorative. They were decorating their settlement for their holiday. Strings of colored light in the dark and the cold, which I suppose should have made the place look festive, if you were the kind of person standing outside in that dark who was inclined to find it festive. What I remember is how clearly those lights defined every entrance, every surface feature, every corner of the structure. The lights were, in tactical terms, an extraordinarily precise map of the settlement's exterior. I noticed that. I filed it away under irrelevant. The lights were for the holiday. The humans were inside. We were not going to be confused about which structures were relevant. I moved on. Hailteth opened the tactical channel, and I heard the formation confirm its readiness. 6 voices, crisp and professional, each giving me their ship name and status in the order the doctrine specified. I gave the order to initiate the first phase, the communications blackout, which involved disabling the relay tower and sealing the settlement's ability to transmit outside the system. This was the most technically delicate phase, and I had assigned it to the Lancer Resev, my most capable electronic warfare ship, under Sub-Commander velthari. The Resev moved to its position on the eastern flank of the ridge, low and slow, exactly as the engagement model had specified. Velthari confirmed target acquisition. The relay tower went dark. That part worked exactly as planned. What happened next, I will describe as precisely as I can, because precision is what the tribunal has asked of me, and because I have found that the only way I am able to speak about these events at all is to stay very close to the facts and not allow myself to drift into interpretation. When I interpret, I find that I cannot continue. So I will give the tribunal facts, and I will let the tribunal interpret them as it sees fit. Approximately 40 seconds after the relay tower went dark, the lights on the settlement's exterior changed. Not went out, changed. The multicolored decorative strings remained burning, but in every visible entrance to the settlement, the 2 surface-level doors I could see from my command position, and 3 that I had not previously noted along the lower ridge face, which were apparently concealed access points that the Ruathi survey had not recorded. In every one of those entrances, a different light came on. A single color. I will not give it a name that suggests I knew what it meant at the time, because I did not. I logged it as a possible alarm response, an interior indicator that the power grid had registered the relay tower's shutdown, or that some autonomous system had detected the electronic pulse from Vethnaelin's work. A reasonable interpretation. A settlement that size would have automation. The light change was probably automated. I told myself it was automated. Hailteth asked if we should hold or continue. I said continue. The Lancer Resev moved to its secondary position. The remaining 5 ships held formation. I was watching the settlement's thermal profile on my secondary display and the exterior view on my primary, and I remember that in the approximately 90 seconds between the relay tower going dark and what I am about to describe, the thermal profile of the settlement shifted. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have triggered an automated alert on my board. But the warmth I had watched for 11 hours, the broad, distributed warmth of a settlement at rest, of people gathered in common rooms, of hearth equivalents running in every section, that warmth began to move, to concentrate, to pool toward the settlement's exterior walls and toward those access points where the single-color lights had come on. I want to be precise about this. The total thermal output of the settlement did not increase. No new heat source activated. No additional power draw registered. What I was seeing was redistribution. The people inside the settlement, all 43 of them, or however many were present that night, were moving. From the interior toward the exterior. From the common rooms toward the doors. Toward us. I noticed this. I did not stop. In my operational calculus at that moment, people moving toward exits is a response to a perceived alarm. They were coming to look, to check the relay tower, to see what had caused the power interruption. People who are coming to check on a relay tower interruption are people who are doing exactly what frightened civilians do in the first moments of a surprise action. They are reactive, confused, and vulnerable. They are not a threat. That is what I told myself. That is what I believed. I want the tribunal to understand that I believed this sincerely and completely, and that I had 17 engagement models and 3 reviewed intelligence assessments and my own 21-action career behind that belief, and that none of it was sufficient. Vice Commander Hailteth initiated the second phase without my explicit confirmation, a judgment call that was within his authority under the operational directive, and that I would not have reversed had he asked me, and the Lancer Drev, our forward interdiction ship, moved to seal the settlement's primary surface access. The Drev was a good ship. Sub-Commander Yethpov had served under me for 6 years. He was precise, cautious, the kind of officer who double-checked his approach vectors before every run and who had, in my personal assessment, the best situational awareness of any sub-commander in the flotilla. The Lancer Drev reached its position at the primary surface access. Then the Lancer Drev was no longer with us. I will not describe what I saw because the tribunal has the sensor logs from my own vessel, and those logs will be more accurate than my recollection. What I will describe is what I heard on the tactical channel. Yethpov's voice. A single transmission. No distress call, no alarm, no report of weapons fire, no description of what he was encountering. Just his voice saying my name, Vice Commander Khan, which is how he always addressed me, not Sarath Khan, saying my name very clearly and very calmly, the way an officer says a commander's name when he wants to be certain the channel is open before he says something important. He said my name. And then nothing. The Lancer Drev's transponder signal was present on my board for another 4 seconds. Then it was not. I checked the frequency. I checked the board. I asked the board's monitoring system to replay the signal log. The signal log showed the Drev's transponder burning clean and constant, and then clean and constant, and then nothing. The tribunal should understand that the Lancer Drev was a purpose-built military vessel with a crew of 22 and combat-rated hull plating designed to resist standard military-grade ordnance at engagement range. I want that in the record, not because it changes anything, because I want the record to carry that fact and let the silence after it speak for itself. Hailteth ordered the formation to fall back to secondary positions on the ridge's far side. This was correct tactical doctrine. We had lost contact with a vessel of unknown cause. We fell back. I did not countermand him. The formation moved. What happened in the next 11 minutes, I will account for ship by ship, in the order it happened, because the order matters, and I will not compress it into a summary that loses the quality of those 11 minutes. The Lancer Resev Vethnaelin's electronic warfare vessel was moving to its secondary position on the eastern flank when it ceased transmitting. No final message, no alarm, no partial transmission, no noise on the channel, no sensor spike that would indicate weapons discharge. The transponder signal was there, steady and correct, and then it was not. This happened while the Resev was still above the ridge line, in open space, at an altitude where there was nothing between it and the void. I ran the sensor log back. The Lancer Resev appeared in the log, steady and correct, and then the log showed empty space where the Resev had been. No debris, no energy signature, no gravitational anomaly, no record of impact with any physical body. The Resev had been in that space, and then that space was empty, and the sensor log was complete and undamaged and showed nothing that explained the difference between those two states. Hailteth's voice on the tactical channel was steady. He is a veteran officer, and he kept his voice steady. He told the formation to hold its secondary positions and to report any sensor contact. The formation reported, nothing to report. The Lancer Orvith, my third ship, Subcommander Karath Dune, 6 years in the flotilla, fell silent approximately 90 seconds after the Resev. Karath Dune managed a partial transmission before the transponder signal vanished. 2 words. The tribunal has the audio log and will hear them in context. What I can say about those 2 words is that they were not a report of a weapons contact, or a description of damage, or a call for support. They were the words of a person who had looked at something, and who wanted to say what the thing was before whatever was about to happen happened, and who had only enough time for 2 words. The 2 words were in our language. They did not describe a weapon or an explosion or an enemy vessel. They described something Karath Dune saw, something at close range, something that, based on everything I know about Karath Dune's character and experience, the sub-commander had not expected to see in that form, in that place, in those circumstances. I have not described those 2 words in any previous inquiry proceeding. I will not describe them here. The tribunal has the audio file. I ask that the tribunal's members listen to the recording in private, not in session, and that they make their own judgment about whether the words require elaboration. Hailteth's voice on the channel, after the Orvith went silent, was still steady. I want to acknowledge that for the record. He had just lost 3 ships in 11 minutes, and his voice was steady. I have served with a great many officers in my career, and I know what it costs to hold your voice steady when ships are disappearing around you, and you have no information and no framework and no category in your training for what is happening. Hailteth held his voice steady, and I want that noted, because it is one of the few things from that night that I can point to and say, that was correct and professional and worth acknowledging. After the Lancer Orvith went silent, I had 3 ships remaining. My own command vessel, the Lancer Thule, Hailteth's Lancer Veth, and the Lancer Sersh under Sub-Commander Anaketh. Hailteth put us into a close formation and moved us to the system's inner boundary, approximately 2 light minutes from the settlement, which is as far as I was willing to go without formally abandoning the operation and triggering the extraction protocol. I was not yet prepared to do that. I had lost 3 ships in 11 minutes against a settlement of 43 inhabitants with no recorded military installation, and I was not yet prepared to call it an abandonment, because I did not have a single sensor reading that told me what had happened to my ships. That is what I want the tribunal to understand. We were not retreating from a known threat. We were retreating from an absence of information. The sensor logs showed nothing I could identify as a weapons discharge. No energy signature consistent with ship-killing ordnance. No debris field. The Lancer Drev, the Lancer Resev, the Lancer Orvith, they were simply no longer present in the system in any form my instruments could locate. I ran the aggregate sensor sweep across all 3 remaining ships' arrays. I tasked Hailteth's sensor team with an independent sweep. I had the Lancer Serge run a parallel sweep on a different frequency band. Nothing. 3 vessels of the Velthari 7th Lancer Flotilla, 66 crew, 2 decades of combined service, absent from the universe in a manner that left no measurable trace. I have been asked whether this absence of sensor data suggests a technical failure of our instruments. I have considered this possibility with care, because it would be the more comfortable conclusion. I reject it. Our sensors were Velthari military grade, recently calibrated, cross-checked across 3 independent systems on 3 different ships. The absence of data was not a failure of our instruments. The absence of data was the data. We held position at 2 light minutes for 22 minutes. I want to be honest about those 22 minutes because I think they are important and because they are the part of the testimony that I have most difficulty giving accurately. The difficulty is not that my memory is unclear. The difficulty is that what I was feeling during those 22 minutes was not something that translates neatly into operational language. And the tribunal has asked for precise operational language. And I am doing my best to honor that request, while also being honest about the limits of precision when describing what it is to sit at 2 light minutes from a warm-lit settlement that has just removed 3 of your ships from the universe without leaving a trace. I was afraid. I will not qualify that. I had been in 21 border actions. I had held my nerve in situations where others had not. I had personally pulled 2 damaged vessels through hostile space under fire and brought their crews home. I knew what fear felt like in an operational context, the useful kind, the kind that sharpens your decisions and keeps you moving correctly. This was not that kind. What I was feeling during those 22 minutes was something closer to the fear I felt as a very young cadet during my first transit through the deep void between systems. That particular quality of silence and distance that the void imposes, the sense that you are very small and very far from anything that would know you were gone. I had not felt that specific quality of fear since I was a cadet. I was feeling it 2 light minutes from a frontier settlement of 43 people celebrating a holiday. I mention this not to dramatize the situation, but because I think it is operationally relevant in a way that I could not have articulated at the time. What I was responding to, I now believe, was not simply the loss of the 3 ships. It was the silence. The absolute, uniform, explanatory silence. The 3 ships were gone, and the settlement was lit and warm and undisturbed. And there was no version of the universe I had lived in up to that night in which those 2 facts could comfortably coexist. My fear, I think, was the sensation of the universe I knew developing a crack. During those 22 minutes, I attempted multiple times to raise the settlement on the emergency hailing frequencies. As before, no response. The relay tower that Vethnalen had disabled was, somehow, active again. I verified this 3 times. Vethnalen had confirmed its shutdown, and Vethnalen was gone, and the relay tower was cycling normally as if it had never been touched. The settlement's exterior lights were still on, all of them. The colored strings for the holiday, the single-color lights above the access points. From 2 light minutes the settlement looked, on long-range optical, exactly as it had looked when we first came over the ridge. Warm and lit and calm and utterly untroubled by the events of the last 11 minutes. I remember looking at that optical image for a long time, at the specific quality of those colored lights in the dark and the cold, and thinking about the fact that someone had hung those lights with their hands, each one, and that the someone who had done that was inside that warm building right now. Hale-Teth recommended withdrawal. I will note for the record that he said it precisely, not as an order, not as a demand, not as panic, but as the kind of recommendation a second-in-command makes when he is certain his commander knows the correct course of action and simply needs to hear the words spoken aloud by someone who is not the commander. He said it the way you say a thing that is already true and simply requires acknowledgement. I told him I wanted one more pass, not an attack run, not a further operational phase, a passive sensor sweep, long range, to try to get a clearer reading on what had happened to the 3 missing ships. He said quietly that he did not believe a closer approach was advisable. I said I understood that, and that I was going to do it anyway. I told him that we could not go back to Tethys Station with nothing except an account of 3 transponders going silent and no explanation, that the fleet needed something more than a gap in the sensor logs, that I owed it to Yeth Pav and Veth Nalen and Kareth Dune to at least try to understand what I was reporting. He did not argue. He knew I was right, and he also knew that right and advisable were not the same word, and his silence after I finished speaking carried both of those things simultaneously. I ordered the Lancerserge to remain at 2 light minutes as a communication relay. If we lost contact with my vessel and Hale-Teth's, Enaketh was to transmit the full sensor record to Tethys Station and withdraw. This was proper protocol. Enaketh confirmed, and I heard in her voice the precise quality of acknowledgement of someone who does not believe they will be transmitting a record of our return. The Lancer Thule and the Lancer Veth moved back toward the settlement. Slowly, passively, every sensor I had was recording. I took us to within 40,000 units of the ridge, close enough for high-resolution thermal imaging, far enough, I told myself, that we were not committed to any particular vector, and that I retained the ability to reverse course. The settlement looked the same. The holiday lights were burning. The single-color access lights were still on. The thermal profile showed warmth behind every wall, warmth moving through every corridor, warmth in every room. I could see on the high-resolution thermal the shapes of people, human shapes, the distinctive bilateral outline, the bright concentrated core of their body temperature, moving inside the settlement. Not agitated movement. Not the movement of a population that had just repelled a military action and was now securing its perimeter and treating its casualties and accounting for its resources. The movement of people going about an evening. The movement of people who had perhaps stepped away from a gathering and returned to it, or who were moving between rooms in the way people move through their homes when they are comfortable and occupied, and the night is long and there is no particular urgency to be anywhere except where they are. I held that image on my display for a long time. I did not know what I was looking for. I do not know, even now, what I expected to find in the thermal profiles of people having a quiet evening inside a warm building. Some evidence that they had done something, I suppose. Some evidence that what I had experienced for the last 30 minutes was connected to the warm shapes on my display. In a way, I could measure and record, and put into a report that a fleet adjutant could read without questioning my fitness for command. The thermal profiles gave me nothing I could use. At some point during those minutes, a single transmission came from the settlement. Not on any hailing frequency I had opened. On a frequency I had not opened. One I had not known the settlement could broadcast on, a frequency that our electronic intelligence files listed as a deep archive velthari military channel that had been decommissioned 40 years ago, and that no one outside our own services should have had the codes for. The transmission was in velthari standard, which is not a language that the human inhabitants of a frontier colony should have spoken. The voice was human, adult, female, I believe, though I acknowledge that human vocal gender markers are not fully reliable across all registers. The transmission said, "We are aware of your position. We are aware you have questions. We recommend you leave the system and do not return, and we wish you a peaceful, long returning light." That is an exact quotation. I have played the audio recording enough times that I am certain I have the words correct. I will repeat them for clarity because they are the center of everything that followed, and because the tribunal should hear them the way I heard them, which is in their exact and complete form. We are aware of your position. We are aware you have questions. We recommend you leave the system and do not return, and we wish you a peaceful, long returning light. I sat with that transmission for some time. Hail Teth did not speak. I did not speak. On my thermal display, the settlement's warmth continued its steady, quiet movement, the shapes of people inside their home on their holiday night, their evening continuing with the particular uninterrupted quality of something that has not, from its own perspective, been interrupted. I tried to understand the transmission. Not the words were clear and required no interpretation. I tried to understand the knowledge it implied. The decommissioned channel, velthari standard, the tone, not the tone of a garrison warning off an approaching force, not the tone of someone who has just destroyed 3 warships and is now telling a 4th to leave. The tone of someone who is being patient with a process they understand well and find, if I am reading the register correctly, somewhat tedious, not cruel, not triumphant. Tired in the way that comes from doing a thing many times over a long period, and finding that the thing is always the same, always ends the same way, and always involves someone on the other side who needs to be reminded of facts they should have known before they arrived. That interpretation may be wrong. I am not a linguist and I had one transmission to work from, but I have thought about it for a long time, and I believe my reading of that tone is accurate. And I believe it is the most important single piece of information in this entire account. I transmitted a reply on the same frequency. I identified myself by name and rank. I asked what had happened to my ships. There was a pause of approximately 40 seconds, which I experienced as considerably longer. The settlement's lights continued burning. The thermal profiles continued their quiet movement. The voice said, "They are not here anymore. That is all I can tell you. What you do with that information is your own business, Vice Commander, but I would not come back here looking for them, and I would not send anyone else to look." I said, "Are they dead?" The settlement was quiet for a moment. I watched the thermal display. The shapes inside moved through their warm rooms. The voice said, "I told you what I can tell you. Go home, Vice Commander. It is a long night and we have been patient and you have been fortunate. Go home." I left the system. I want to be entirely clear with the tribunal about why I left. I did not leave because I had completed my mission, or achieved any objective, or because I had evaluated all remaining options and concluded that withdrawal was the tactically superior choice. I left because someone in a warm underground dwelling on a frozen frontier world told me I had been fortunate, in a voice that did not sound boastful or threatening or angry, and I believed that voice completely, and I did not want to discover what the alternative to fortunate looked like. The Lancer Serge was waiting at 2 light minutes. Anaketh confirmed our approach on the tactical channel and did not ask what had happened. She could see from the formation that Hail Teth and I were the only ones coming back. She held her questions for transit, and then she held them for the approach to the rim, and then she held them for the fold. And by the time we reached Tethai Station, she had found the discipline not to ask them at all. That was correct of her. There was nothing I could have told her that would have been useful, and she knew that. We transmitted the incident report to Tethai Station from the outer rim, before fold transit, as per protocol. I will not describe what happened at Tethai Station in the immediate aftermath, because most of it is covered in sealed proceedings, and because the parts that are not sealed are not relevant to what I am asked to account for here. What I will say is that the names and the ranks that were present in the initial debrief session at Tethai Station, and who had the authority to order the fleet's response to the incident report, and who made the decisions that shaped what happened in the weeks and months that followed, those names and ranks are known to the tribunal and need not be repeated by me. I will say only that the decisions made in that debrief session were not, in my judgment, the decisions of people who had fully absorbed what I had reported. They were the decisions of people who had received a report about an operational failure on the border and were processing it as a report about an operational failure on the border. A question of intelligence gaps, of planning inadequacy, of whether the survey data should have been more thoroughly reviewed. I sat in that debrief room and I listened to those conversations, and I understood, in a way I had not fully understood until that moment, that the thing I had experienced at Frontier Marker 11 was not going to fit into any category that the debrief room was equipped to work with, and that the fleet would draw the conclusions it was capable of drawing and file the records it was capable of filing, and that the record would be accurate as far as it went, and that it would not go far enough, and that there was nothing I could do about that. The border protocol for the Velthari's reach was revised within 30 days. The human settlements Marker 11 and 14 others in the reach were reclassified as prohibited engagement zones. This was done quietly, without public announcement, under the authority of the War Council's standing emergency orders. The reclassification was categorized in the administrative record not as a military retreat or a policy change, but as a routine survey reclassification. Routine survey reclassification. I want that phrase in this testimony, because it will be in the archive beside my testimony, and I want the archive to carry both phrases together and let whoever reads them draw their own conclusions about whether they describe the same event. The Lancer Thule, my vessel, was decommissioned within 2 months and placed in reserve. Official reason: scheduled maintenance and refit. The Lancer Veth was transferred to the outer Drevian corridor. Hale Teth accepted the transfer without objection. I have not spoken to him since the transit home. Subcommander Anaketh of the Lancer Serch requested transfer to the fleet's cartographic survey division and was approved within the same month. She is now mapping deep space in the outer rim of the galactic north. I understand why she requested that posting. I made a similar request. Mine was not approved for reasons I was told were administrative. I will now address something that I have not addressed in any previous proceeding, because no previous proceeding had the standing to compel my answer, and none asked the question directly. The tribunal has asked me to provide my full assessment of what occurred at Frontier Marker 11, not merely the sequence of events, but what I believe those events indicate about the nature of the threat, and whether the fleet's current understanding of that threat is adequate. My answer is no. The fleet's current understanding is not adequate, and I believe the inadequacy is structural rather than informational. The fleet understands now, after Marker 11, and after the other incidents that I am told are sealed in parallel proceedings I have not been permitted to read, that humans are dangerous in the field, that their ships are capable, that direct fleet engagement with human forces is to be avoided. The standing protocols reflect this. They are not wrong. What the protocols do not reflect, and what I believe cannot be easily incorporated into operational doctrine, because it requires a category of understanding that is not native to military planning, is this: the humans in the field, the humans who make the fleet dangerous to engage, the humans who have built the reputation that keeps our warships out of direct contact, those humans are not the whole picture. A human away from home is formidable. A human in their home is something else. I do not know how to quantify the difference. I do not know what produces it, or how it scales, or whether there are conditions under which it diminishes. What I know is what I measured at Frontier Marker 11. 43 inhabitants of a small underground frontier settlement, gathered in warmth on their holiday night, who became aware of the approach of 6 military vessels, and who responded by doing nothing that my instruments could measure, and who did it in 11 minutes, and who afterwards transmitted a polite recommendation that I leave. The transmission specifically noted that they had been patient. I want the tribunal to sit with that word, patient, not defensive, not victorious, not even particularly alarmed. Patient, as though the process of having 6 military vessels approach their settlement and then not be there anymore was a familiar inconvenience that required patience to handle correctly, rather than a military crisis requiring exceptional effort. I have thought about what that word implies about the number of times this has happened before, at Marker 11, or at other settlements, or across the long history of human presence on this frontier. I have thought about how many operational briefs, how many routine survey reclassifications, how many sealed proceedings are accumulating in the fleet archive around that one word, patient, and what the aggregate of those documents says about the shape of what is on the other side of the border. I have not been able to stop thinking about it. I will now describe the thing I learned after returning that I believe belongs in this record, not as operational intelligence. The tribunal has its own analysts for that, but as context for everything I have said, and for the word the voice used when it told me I had been fortunate. In the days after our return, before the tribunal proceedings were opened, I found a translation of the holiday the humans at Marker 11 were observing, the long returning light. I had given the surface translation in this testimony, the astronomical one, the seasonal one, the return of light after the long winter dark. That is the literal translation, and it is accurate. But there is a secondary meaning. The linguistic files note it, and I had not read the linguistic files before the operation because linguistic files are not part of our standard pre-operation intelligence review. The secondary meaning is older than the astronomical tradition. It is, according to the human ethnographic records that the fleet's Cultural Intelligence Division maintains, and that operational planning almost never consults, the original meaning. And the original meaning is this: the safe return of those who were away, the gathering of the family back to itself, the affirmation, made in warmth and light and the company of the people you chose, that everyone who went out into the dark has come home. The humans at Marker 11 were celebrating a night about coming home. And we came to their home on that night, uninvited and armed, with an operational brief that called it a soft target. And I think now that there was never a version of that equation that ended differently. I think that whatever a human is, whatever history and whatever circumstances made them what they are, the version of a human that exists on the night when the family is gathered, and the lights are burning, and the celebration is in full warmth, and the doors face outward toward the dark. That version does not have an upper limit that our instruments can measure. I think the Ruathi cartographer knew this. I think Vetharun Salisk flew over that settlement and looked down and made his measurements and flew on. And in the silence on his transit home, he thought about what he had seen, and he wrote 5 words at the edge of the page. The settlement is not as it appears from above. He could have written more. He had more words. He chose 5 words and a recommendation to verify, and I think he assumed I would understand what the 5 words meant, because anyone who had spent time near the human frontier and asked the right questions should have understood. And the fact that I did not understand was a failure of my own inquiry, rather than a failure of his warning. I understand the 5 words now. I have been asked by the tribunal whether, in light of my account, I would recommend any specific change to the fleet's border protocols in the Vethai's Reach or in other human frontier zones. I will give my answer directly. I recommend that the reclassification of Marker 11 and the other 14 settlements be made permanent, that the prohibited engagement designation be extended to every human settlement in the Reach regardless of size or apparent military capacity, and that the phrase soft target be removed from the fleet's operational vocabulary, as it applies to any human installation, frontier or otherwise, garrisoned or not, inhabited by any number of humans down to the smallest family unit. I recommend this not as a tactical adjustment. I recommend it as an acknowledgement of a fact that the fleet's operational doctrine has not yet formally incorporated. There is no human settlement that is a soft target. The category does not exist. A human garrison is dangerous because it is a garrison. A human family on their holiday night is dangerous because it is a family on their holiday night. These are not the same kind of danger, and they do not require the same kind of caution, but they both require caution of a kind that the word soft does not contain. I hold no rank. I command no vessel. I will not take another commission. This is in the record as a personal decision communicated to Fleet Administration in writing, not as a disciplinary consequence, though I am aware that the distinction may appear academic from the outside. When I am asked by younger officers why I left the service, I tell them I had a long career and it was time. I do not tell them about Frontier Marker 11. I tell them instead the one thing I know that is both true and transmissible, and I tell them every time I am given the opportunity, because I have found that framing it as personal advice rather than doctrine means that junior officers actually hear it instead of filing it. The advice is this: the humans you read about in the engagement files, the ones in open space, the ones on contested routes, the ones at the edge of their expanding frontier, those humans are worth every measure of caution the fleet gives them. The standing protocols are not wrong. The avoidance is correct. Every officer in the fleet who has ever served near the human border and come back to describe the experience agrees on this. And their agreement is not the agreement of shared doctrine, but the agreement of shared observation. And those are different things, and the difference is important. But if you ever find yourself reading a thermal profile and the profile is warm, if you ever find yourself looking at exterior lights that someone has strung by hand in the cold because they wanted their home to look welcoming, if you ever find yourself listening to a hailing frequency and hearing no response from a relay tower that is visibly active and cycling, if you ever find yourself at the controls of a ship over a human dwelling on any night, and especially on the long returning light, turn around. Plot your fold coordinates and notify your crew and leave that system without logging the approach in any document that might encourage a future commander to think the operation was incomplete. Leave, and keep those lights in your rear display until you clear the system boundary, and then find a way to keep them in your memory for the rest of your career, because memory is what the fleet's operational doctrine has so far failed to accumulate, and what the sealed archive will, eventually, have to stand in for. Because those people told you to go. They told you that you were fortunate, and they were not boasting, and they were not threatening, and they were not performing for your benefit. They were being accurate, and the accuracy of that statement, and the patience in the voice that delivered it, and the warmth still visible in every room of that settlement when you aimed your rear sensors back at it as you left. All of that is the clearest operational intelligence the fleet possesses about what is on the other side of the human border. And no one is writing it into the briefs. I was Sarath Khan, Vice Commander of the Velthari 7th Lancer Flotilla. I led 6 ships to a human dwelling on the night of the long returning light, and I came back with 2, and I have given this tribunal every word of what I know about why that is the case. That is my testimony. That is all of it. I have one final matter to place in the record, and then I am done. The tribunal's preliminary brief, which I was given before this session, asked me a question that no previous proceeding has asked. It asked, in the time between the loss of the 3rd ship and the final transmission from the settlement, what was the state of the remaining crews? I have not been asked this before because, I suspect, the previous inquiries were focused on the operational sequence, the what and the when, rather than on the human quality of the account, or the alien quality. The tribunal has decided that the account is incomplete without this, and I agree with that judgment, and I will answer it. When the Lancer Orvith went silent and I had 3 ships remaining, the tactical channel went through a period of approximately 4 minutes in which no one spoke. I did not issue an order. Hail Teth did not make a recommendation. The crews of the Thule, the Veth, and the Serch held their positions and said nothing. I could hear, on the command net, the background sounds of 3 ships operating, the cycling of environmental systems, the soft, regular tone of navigation confirming position, the occasional electronic double-click, that means a sensor operator has flagged something for review and cleared it. The machinery of 3 ships going about their work in the silence left by the absence of 3 others. I have thought about those 4 minutes more than I have thought about almost any other part of the account, including the transmission and the losses themselves. Because those 4 minutes were not panic and they were not confusion, and they were not the sound of a formation falling apart. They were the sound of experienced officers and crews sitting very still and very quietly with the knowledge that 3 ships had just stopped existing in ways they could not explain, and choosing, in that silence, to continue functioning. I do not know what each member of those crews was thinking. I know what I was thinking, and I have described it. But the crews, 54 people across 3 ships, ranging from my most senior officers to a navigation cadet on the Serge who had been in the flotilla for less than a year, 54 people absorbed what had happened and held their stations and waited for an order. When the order came, Hail Teth's order to fall back to the inner boundary, they executed it without comment. Cleanly, correctly, in formation, as if the maneuver were a training exercise and not a withdrawal from a position where 3 of their sister ships had just gone silent against an enemy that had made no sound and left no trace. I have commanded forces under fire. I know what a competent crew looks like when the situation is bad and the training is holding. Those 54 people were holding their training against something that their training had not been designed for, and they held it. And I want that in the record beside the account of the ships that were lost. At the inner boundary, during the 22 minutes we held position, there was some talk on the crew nets. I monitored it. Not orders and not reports, the kind of talk that happens when people are waiting and the waiting is bad and the quiet is worse than the talk. I will not reproduce those conversations in detail, because they are personal, and because the crew members on the Veth and the Serge are still serving, and do not need their private words in a tribunal record. What I can say is that the conversations were not the conversations of people who had given up or lost control. They were the conversations of people trying to give the situation a shape that fit inside something they knew, reaching for analogies and precedents and explanations, doing what people do when the thing in front of them is genuinely new. They try to find the edge of what is old in it and work outward from there. None of them found the right edge. There was no right edge in our experience to work from, but they tried in the 22 minutes at the inner boundary, and then they stopped trying when Hail Teth gave the order to move, and they executed the approach with the same precision they had shown throughout. Every one of them. I know that most of the crew members of the Lancer Veth and the Lancer Serge have since applied for or been granted transfers away from the human border region. I know that the navigation cadet from the Serge, whose name I will not place in this record without authorization, put in her transfer within a week of our return and was posted to an administrative station in the interior within the month. I do not judge any of them. I put in my own transfer request, as I have noted. What I judge is the gap between what those 54 people experienced and what the operational record, as it currently exists, is capable of containing. The operational record will show 3 vessels lost, cause undetermined, 2 vessels withdrew, incident classified, border protocol revised, routine survey reclassification applied. What the operational record cannot show is the 4 minutes of silence on the tactical channel after the Lancer Orvith went quiet. It cannot show Hail Teth keeping his voice steady when everything around him had stopped making sense. It cannot show the navigation cadet on the Serge running sensor sweeps at 2 light minutes with the particular quality of attention that comes from having decided, somewhere in the last hour, that you are going to do your job perfectly because it is the only thing left that is entirely yours to control. It cannot show any of that, and that is the gap, and the gap is not administrative. It is the gap between a notation that says soft target and the reality of what is behind that notation. Close the gap, reclassify the settlements, update the briefs, read the margin notes, and if you find yourself someday approaching a warm settlement on a dark night, with colored lights strung along its walls and warmth distributed through every room, and a voice comes on a frequency you did not know they had, speaking your language in a tone that implies a patience with you that you have not earned. Listen to that voice. Leave while it is still offering you the word fortunate. I was Sarath Khan. I held 6 ships and I came back with 2, and that is everything I know.